The next panel will be Nina Shea, Director, Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson Institute, and Dina Gerges, Egyptian-American democracy activist, attorney, and member of the Egyptian-American Rule of Law. If you could keep your testimony to 5 minutes each, I would appreciate it, and then we will proceed. Is Mr. Pitts going to be at 11:30? Your full statements will appear in the record. If you could just proceed 5 minutes each, I would appreciate it. And with that, Ms. Shea, I'll go to Nina first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Co-Chairman. It's a real honor to be appearing before this commission to talk about a very serious and developing human rights crisis, the deepening repression against Egypt's Coptic Christians, who are the Muslim Middle East's largest religious minority at this point. We're hearing reports from human rights groups in Egypt that is tens of thousands, up to maybe 100,000 of this population have already left Egypt during this Arab winter. And we believe that the numbers will soar in the months ahead. And as with other sudden mass exoduses in world history, this one is a sure sign that a minority community faces persecution. During the elections of this recent days, we have determined, our analyst, Sam Tadros, who is a Coptic Christian in our office, that Islamists of various stripes have won 65% of the seats in the lower house up to now. The Taliban-like Salafi movement captured about 25% of the seats. This is another vote, but of the seats. And the Muslim Brotherhood captured about 40% of the seats. By comparison, the secular-leaning Egyptian bloc, backed with heavy Coptic and other liberal support, came in a very distant third. And it seems that our U.S. aid for the nuts and bolts of the process has been completely wasted because these other groups are not democratic in their programs. We also project that overall, after all the parliamentary voting is done for the lower house, that Islamists will gain 76% of the lower house seats in parliament in the 3 rounds. The implication of an Islamist mandate is much more far-reaching than is suggested by the international news articles, which typically stress possible alcohol and entertainment bans. And in fact, the fundamental individual freedoms of religion and speech and democracy itself are all at risk. Moreover, the new constitution will be drafted by persons selected by this new Islamist-dominated parliament. A larger danger will be presented by blasphemy and apostasy codes, which will suppress the Copts, and possibly the building of their churches and how they build their churches, whether they can have domes maybe or bells or singing, could be interpreted as an insult to Islam, but also other minority groups, Baha'is, Quranists, Shiites, minority Muslims, dissident Muslims, and so forth. The Copts have long been caught in a vice between 2 competing forces, a brutal military government and religiously intolerant Islamists. These 2 forces working usually independently, but on occasion together, especially at the lower ranks of the security services, direct periodic violent and indiscriminate attacks against Copts and their churches. On occasion, and now with increasing frequency, these attacks are taking the form of pogroms on vulnerable Coptic villagers. This situation is exacerbated by state laws that suppress Christians' ability to repair or build churches. The government has time and again failed to protect Coptic minorities from such violence and denies them justice in the wake of attacks, sometimes arresting the victims themselves along with the attackers or instead of attackers, and at other times resolving the matter not with a judgment of law, but simply with a forced handshake between assailant and victim. One of the most graphic recent demonstrations of this pattern of attack and impunity was this Maspero episode in October. And appended to my testimony are digests of about over 100 incidences of attacks against Copts and problems of religious freedom experienced by the Copts in the last 18 months, and I'd like to include that for the record.
Sure, without objection.
Thank you. In the Maspero event, which is the only one I'll really mention, Coptic Christians marching through a section of Cairo to protest religious repression were ruthlessly dispersed by the military, resulting in dozens killed and hundreds wounded. Islamists then attacked the hospitals and funeral processions for the victims. The government denied responsibility for the army's attack on the demonstrators, exonerated the military, and arrested about 28 people, almost all of them Copts. And this is the investigation. They're still in prison, and this is the investigation that Ms. Fitzpatrick has just mentioned. They and at least one other person who criticized the military actions at Maspero in a blog, that is Abdel Fattah, a secular Muslim, who's now charged with or facing charges of inciting to terrorism because he criticized the military, are reportedly still in prison. The forensic evidence of the murders at Maspero indicate that one-third were killed with under the treads of the tanks. They were crushed to death, and 2/3 were killed with live ammunition. And I spoke with the Maspero youth group leader just the last few days, and he, raised the question that this ammunition may have been provided by U.S. military aid. It is apparent that Copts will be forced to continue to contend with this military and will now also face a much empowered Islamist sector. The previously underground and unorganized Salafis are forthright about what they hope to bring about with their newfound strength. They describe their plans for a Sharia system, similar to one we see in Saudi Arabia or maybe under the Taliban. Quite simply, freedom of speech and religion as we know it will not be permitted if they have their way. The biggest winner, of course, was the Muslim Brotherhood, and they have not been as clear in articulating its vision for governance. But its Freedom and Justice Party has issued a 93-page program, which sheds some light on it. Samuel Tadros, a fellow at the Hudson Center for Religious Freedom, noted in reviewing this program, the Brotherhood is pragmatic, but it is not moderate. And Tadros writes in the new issue of Hudson's Current Trends Journal, quote, "The first clear aspect of the Freedom and Justice Party program is the totality of its vision. There is no aspect of human life that the program does not aim to discuss or put under state regulation. In what should seem bewildering to outside observers, the program leaves no detail unmentioned, from participation in cultural festivals abroad to fast and free internet services and even to publishing scholarly journals. The view it takes of all human actions as regulated and supervised by the state leaves no room for doubt on the kind of state they aim to build." He goes on to say, the program then explains the goal of the party is, quote, "cleansing the hearts and the soul and hearts, upgrading the feelings, refining the character by calling for a commitment to worship, good manners, sociability, and behavior, and to remind people of God, the day of judgment, so as to wake up conscience." It states that the Mubarak regime had turned Egypt away from God and, quote, "into a colony of Western and Zionist policies." According to the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party program, quote, "forgetting the day of judgment and God is one of the most important reasons that led to the Egyptian people's revolt." It promises to tie politics to Islamist principles and values. The principles of Islamist Sharia are the main source of legislation, while the non-Muslim minority is given the right to resort to their own religious rulings in family and religious affairs. In short, the Copts now confront a political future defined by, for a time being, secular but brutal military and all-encompassing regulatory Islamist state that mixes Sharia strictures with pragmatic measures. And by the way, this raises the possibility of maybe a possible threat of a nationalized Coptic church and a nationalized Coptic endowment, something to be on alert about. There is little room for optimism, not only for the Copts, but for Egyptian liberals in general. For American foreign policy, there will be no good choices, only less bad ones. We will need to discern what they are. Certainly admonishing the Copts, along with their persecutors, to use restraint as the White House did in its only public response to the Maspero massacre, is not right, nor just, nor helpful in advancing American interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before the next witness, I'm going to put all of the statements of all of the witnesses in the congressional record too, because I think we're reaching a kind of a defining moment on this issue. And I have noticed too that many of the media call the Muslim Brotherhood the moderates. It's interesting. There was one piece the other day. The next witness, please.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for organizing this hearing. Thank you to you, Chairman Wolf, for tirelessly advocating on behalf of human rights around the world, in Egypt in particular, and for the cause of religious freedom. Thank you, Congressman Pitts, as well. It's very telling that in 2011 alone, I've testified twice already before on the plight of Coptic Christians, who represent approximately 12% of Egypt's 85 million people. It has indeed been a year of trials and tribulations for the Coptic people, and I don't think I'm going to go over everything that's happened this year. I think we've heard it already, and we'll hear from more witnesses. I'll just go ahead and jump to the area which I'd like to cover today, which is the responsibility of the SCAF, the government's role in promoting this kind of sectarian violence just over the past 10 months. We know well what the Mubarak regime was up to for the 3 decades that he was in power, but we don't hear all that much about what the SCAF has been doing with regards to religious freedom and potentially its collusion with Islamist forces that have led us to the place that we're at today. So while Copts cautiously welcomed Egypt's revolution on January 25th, their hopes for new Egypt that would reverse the persecution that they faced under the Mubarak regime are being systematically dashed. Indeed, fears of further institutionalized discrimination being leveled against them are being given life through the preliminary results of Egypt's first post-revolutionary parliamentary elections, which Ms. Shea discussed. It's this matter that I'd like to focus on as the conduct of these elections epitomize the alarming situation facing not just Egypt's Copts, but the United States as it attempts to forge coherent and effective policy towards a key ally in the Middle East in post-revolutionary transition. So on November 28th, as we know, Egypt embarked on stage 1 of multi-phase elections. There are 3 phases for these elections in a highly charged environment that calls into doubt the integrity of the entire process for a number of reasons. On November 18th, Egypt witnessed the resurgence of violence against peaceful protesters by Egyptian security forces under the direction of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF, which had become the object of growing frustration by Egyptians who increasingly view the military regime as the main counter-revolutionary force. In the span of 1 week, Egyptian security forces rained down on the square with huge quantities of tear gas and rubber-coated steel bullets in what the State Department itself deemed a, quote, excessive show of force, which left over 40 people dead and thousands injured. As battles reminiscent of war zones rage on in Tahrir and across the country until the day before the election, SCAF nonetheless announced its intent to move forward with these elections, joined in its call by only one political force in the country, the Islamists, comprised of the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, whose political party is the Freedom and Justice Party, or the FJP, and the hardline Salafis and their party, which is the Noor Party, although they have other political parties as well. Egyptians were thus expected, somehow ludicrously, to take to the streets and to polling stations in this environment of extreme physical insecurity. Exacerbating these stark conditions were a number of other factors, including a confounding electoral law, which even the most seasoned analysts could not explain to you, indicating obviously a decreased level of understanding by your average voter. Additionally, Egypt's political spectrum at this point suffers from extreme polarization fed by anti-revolutionary propaganda by the SCAF, as well as a religious propaganda war waged against Egypt's not just Christians, but liberals overall. Even Muslim liberals are now deemed apostates by some of these more extremist movements. So these kinds of propaganda wars have been condoned by SCAF and condoned by SCAF's Supreme Election Committee, which is the committee charged with regulating the conduct of these elections and laying down the rules and procedures governing the elections. For example, only weeks before the election, in response to numerous complaints that had been submitted, legal complaints regarding violations on the ban on religious campaigning, including through sermons and mosques and other such means, the election committee simply responded by saying it would not be able to control these kinds of violations given their frequency. End of story. When voters headed to the polls, expectedly, these violations continued and escalated, and election monitoring organizations decried and continue to decry numerous abuses, which they say are being overwhelmingly committed by the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi parties. Some of these violations documented in the media include group voting, vote buying, very much in the footsteps of Mubarak's National Democratic Party. Methods being used are distribution of basic food staples to Egypt's poorest in exchange for their votes, and more insidiously, religious propaganda, specifically anti-Christian propaganda, which, by the way, is not just used against Christian candidates, who are very few in this election, but are being used against Muslim liberal candidates as well. Complaints regarding, so when I say that Muslim candidates that are part of the Egyptian bloc, which is the liberal bloc, because they are in alliance with parties that have large Coptic constituencies, those are labeled as also Christian, and anyone that votes for these Muslim candidates is implicitly somehow supporting Christians against Islam. So complaints regarding representatives of both the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi Noor Party representatives in polling stations in close proximity to voting booths, directing the elderly and the uneducated on how to vote abound, as do complaints regarding niqabi women or women that cover their faces, engaging in group voting and other kinds of fraud. Those complaints abound as well. At one point during the elections, the Salafi Noor Party identified the liberal Egyptian bloc, which I just mentioned, as the, quote, Crusaders bloc, and tried to intimidate Muslim veiled women who attempted to side with the bloc, deeming them apostates. More seriously, those tasked with even impartially overseeing the election process. In Egypt, every electoral district has to be monitored by a judge. Well, in one district, a judge closed down his station early because, quote, too many unveiled women were showing up to vote, end quote. Court decisions invalidating elections in numerous districts are already being handed down, most of which are being ignored by the election committee, resulting in confusion that casts doubt on the integrity of the new parliament once its members are elected. So this is all quite worrying. All these violations notwithstanding, Egypt's elections do represent a relatively improved process over what Egyptians experienced during the Mubarak era. Some observers point to the substantially higher voter turnout rate during the first 2 days of the election, estimated at 52%, compared to the low teens during the Mubarak era, to support this conclusion. But I submit, Mr. Chairman, that to surrender to this conclusion and to the results of this election as a fair representation of Egypt's political landscape, and in particular its revolutionary aspirations, would be fatally flawed. Egypt's election is not to be evaluated by the conduct of the few days in which Egyptians cast their ballots, but by the events that have unfolded since the SCAF assumed power, since Mubarak's ouster in February, which paints a much more troubling picture. First, ahead of the vote, Egypt's voters were threatened with a £500 fine, prohibitive for most of Egypt's poor. 40% of Egyptians live under $2 a day, by the way, if they don't vote. After the government announced it would not be imposing such fines, voter turnout dropped to 20% during the runoff elections. This perhaps at least partly explains why voter turnout during the first few days was relatively high, and again cast doubt on, quote, the democratic achievement that these elections represent. Additionally, since February, the SCAF has tried over 12,000 civilians, most of whom are liberal activists, including the young blogger that Ms. Shea mentioned, Ala Abdel Fattah, who is an advocate for pluralism. He absurdly is one of the people that is being tried for leveling violence against the Copts in the Maspero massacre. The SCAF has made opaque decisions concerning Egypt's transitional roadmap and dictated a plan unequivocally favoring Islamists over other political forces. In March, SCAF appointed an all-male, 10-member constitutional committee to draft constitutional amendments. This committee was headed by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and comprised by at least 2 other members with the same affiliation. Since then, SCAF has consistently refused to consider the drafting of a constitution first, which was the demand of Egypt's revolutionary and liberal forces, opting instead to move forward with parliamentary elections and granting the new parliament the power to draft Egypt's new constitution. This decision was and is highly unusual, since constitutions across the world are normally drafted through some sort of national consensus mechanism, and not by one of the interested branches of government, which itself should be regulated by constitutional law. SCAF has consistently refused to entertain that notion. Because Islamists were the strongest and only opposition allowed to exist during the Mubarak era, it was logical and expected that they would stand the most to gain from any election taking place shortly after Mubarak's ouster, especially with liberal parties lacking sufficient time to mount extensive grassroots campaigns, placing them at a serious disadvantage. That Islamists would unfairly hold sway in Egypt's parliamentary elections taking place according to SCAF's timetable was expected. And the U.S. must ask why SCAF has systematically worked to undermine liberal and revolutionary forces and their chances for electoral gains over the course of the last 10 months. In addition to mandating a flawed transition plan, the SCAF has undermined the flourishing of civil society through, for example, going so far as to reverse court decisions permitting the establishment of independent labor unions. The SCAF has waged a vicious propaganda war against Egypt's liberals, at some point also going so far as to vilify groups such as April 6, which played a key role in Egypt's 18-day uprising, calling them, quote, agents of the United States. The SCAF passed an electoral law which could charitably be described as enigmatic, as I mentioned before, and engaged in electoral redistricting, highly favorable, again, to Islamist forces. The SCAF has tolerated an escalation of the level of violence against Copts by Muslims, continued the usual impunity, and itself carried out an unprecedented level of attacks and massacres against Copts during the same time period. The SCAF has woefully mismanaged Egypt's transition in just about every way imaginable and created an environment of fear, resulting in suspicion and polarization as opposed to solidarity. All these factors beg the question of collusion between the SCAF and Egypt's Islamists, potentially to safeguard the extensive privileges of Egypt's top generals who stand to lose much by the transition to a genuine civilian democratic state which would not hold any institution above the law. This collusion, whether intended or otherwise, has resulted in a very dangerous formula, placing Egypt on the road to be the next Pakistan. While a survey conducted by state television just days ago placed support for a, quote, civil state, meaning non-religious, non-military, at 51%, with support for a, quote, civil state with an Islamic background trailing at 43%, and support for a religious state at only 6%, thus far the elections have produced much more extreme results, highlighting the incongruence of the results with Egyptian societal trends. According to official election results, the Muslim Brotherhood, as Ms. Shea mentioned, has won approximately 37% of the vote, followed by hardline Salafis with 25% of the vote, resulting in a potential Islamist bloc of over 60% should the two parties join in a parliamentary coalition. Now, they may not. The Muslim Brotherhood may choose to enter into a coalition with the liberal bloc. If the trends continue as expected over the next two electoral phases, Islamists will maintain this majority, if not reach a supermajority of 66% or higher. Prominent Salafi party leaders have gone on record recently to state that, quote, democracy is anti-Islamic, that minorities will have to pay a special tax known as jizya and be expelled from military service, among numerous other frightening declarations which Ms. Shea also alluded to. The Salafis have also announced their intentions to curb individual and personal freedoms, such as women's dress and the consumption of alcohol. If this occurs, this will represent the replacement of Mubarak's authoritarian dictatorship with a religious one, and the true subversion of Egypt's revolution. As a matter of fact, the parliament will have nearly no representation for Egypt's young revolutionaries who carried out the ouster of Mubarak, the revolution. It will also place in jeopardy Egypt's international standing, relationship with the United States, and potentially adverse its international treaty obligations, all very serious matters. While the will of the Egyptian people as expressed through the ballot box should be respected, we should not lose sight that elections are not the only cornerstone of democracy, particularly when they're taking place under such deeply flawed conditions. The U.S. ought now more than ever to clearly communicate to the SCAF that engineering skewed results that are reached through the blatant manipulation of voters and the electoral process are not in keeping with democratic practices the U.S. wishes to see. This is also a very good time, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, and others, to revive the conditionality debate, the foreign aid bills and conference, and we would very much like to see the conditions that are within it passed, as well as additional conditions which I'll mention right now, namely to ensure an end to the persecution of Egypt's liberal activists, the thriving of which will benefit not only all Egyptians, will benefit all Egyptians, including the Copts, and that the new constitution reflects respect for pluralism, religious freedom, shared power, and fundamental human rights. Thus far, the administration has unequivocally rejected conditionality, hoping in so doing to maintain open channels of dialogue and influence with the SCAF. That hasn't been terribly useful. When the Assistant Secretary was talking about the committee charged with investigating Maspero, she failed to mention that the committee is in fact a military committee. An institution which committed the massacre cannot investigate itself. But in any case, there have been no more dire circumstances to warrant the clear communication of America's values and interests to the SCAF than these that we're living right now. Contrary to what the administration may believe, Egypt's elections and the further oppression of Egypt's Christian minorities are the guarantors of further instability. Meanwhile, Egypt's Copts will continue to fight for equal citizenship and for their rightful place in Egypt's future. I exhort all sectors of the U.S. government to stand with their courageous struggle. I'll leave you with the words of Bishoy Tamri, who lost his friend Mina Daniel, very well-known activist during the Maspero massacre. He said, quote, "Since the attacks on Copts began in the past few months, many Christians have been thinking of emigrating. Now, after the victory of the Islamists, these plans will become reality, and many Christians are already packing their bags. However, there is another group, which includes the Christian revolutionaries, who are adamant to stay in Egypt and continue the fight. This includes me and my friends. We will struggle. We will fight." Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both for your testimony. As I said, we're going to put them in the congressional record, and I would urge Ms. Fitzpatrick, if you can make sure the Secretary of State sees their testimony also, and we will send a copy of both of your testimonies to Secretary Panetta and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs too. The next Pakistan is very, very depressing. Mr. Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dina, what should the United States and the international community be doing in order to press the Egyptian military to protect the rights of the minorities?
First of all, Mr. Pitts, thank you so much. I share your frustration that I think I heard with the Assistant Secretary regarding airing these grievances and recommendations time and time again to little avail, it seems. As I mentioned in my testimony, the administration is at a place where it's refusing to entertain the notion of conditionality, despite strong urging from other sectors in the U.S. government, including yourselves here in the United States Congress, which we really do appreciate. Back in January, I had recommended the appointment of a special envoy, and I'm very grateful to see that in the works and taking place. I look forward to it being given life with the administration's cooperation. However, I really do mean it when I say that there is no better time to consider conditionality and place it very much again on the table, because I think once Egypt's new constitution is written, this will really close the door on any potential positive future coming out of all of this. I mean, it's understandable that the transition will be rocky and will take time, and we have to be patient. However, what we must not do is allow certain things to be written in stone that will set a very negative trend, and I think one of those things is the drafting of the Constitution. The United States does wield leverage. One of the very unfortunate things is, as Chairman Wolf mentioned, and as I mentioned in my testimony before the Helsinki Commission, to see the representatives of CENTCOM making the rounds with representatives from SCAF to lobby only days after the Maspero massacre to not condition assistance to Egypt. This is extremely tragic, and I think ultimately a very wrong route for the United States to take.
What do you see happening with the youth movement that is disappointed in the outcome of recent elections, and what are the possibilities of increased violence again?
I think, Mr. Pitts, that the street is still there despite all the challenges and the violence that is being meted out to the young revolutionaries through whether institutionalized forms of attacks, such as this new electoral law, which, for example, privileges Islamists above and beyond everybody else, or through actual physical violence. And it is my worry, Congressman Pitts, that after the new parliament is elected, the SCAF, in collusion with this parliament, will actually destroy what remains of this opposition and these young revolutionaries, not just destroy them morally in terms of discrediting them and all the other means that we are accustomed to after 30 years of the Mubarak dictatorship, but actually physically destroy them. And I think it should be a top priority for the United States to ensure the physical safety of these young revolutionaries before anything else. I think that if this new parliament attempts to forge a constitution which is not representative of Egyptians' aspirations, I think the street is very much there and will be out and active again. And this is when we really, really need to pay attention.
What's your assessment of the military's willingness to, or some in the existing government, to implement true justice for Maspero and other incidents, versus simply arresting a few Muslims, few Christians, blaming them for the violence, and like they've been doing for years?
I have very little faith, Mr. Pitts, in the SCAF's ability or even will to bring justice or to see justice done for the Coptic people. As a matter of fact, while Copts were being run over by armored personnel carriers, the SCAF instructed its official media to go out and say that Copts were attacking our military and exhorting honorable citizens to come to the defense of the military, which resulted in vigilante acts of violence against Copts. This is not a government that is acting fairly or remotely responsibly. And those are all questions that need to be posed, and unfortunately questions that the administration and in particular the Pentagon seems very reluctant to pose. Why are all of these things that are happening, that are documented in terms of laws that are being passed and actions that are being taken, prosecutions of liberal activists, civilians, and military tribunals, why are all of these things occurring to the severe disadvantage of Egypt's revolutionaries? And nobody seems interested in asking these questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Pitts. We've been joined by Congressman Chris Smith and Congressman Trent Franks, and I appreciate them both being here. I think the administration is going to have to ask the question next year, who lost Egypt? You remember who lost China? Who lost Egypt? And it troubles me, too, to see our military coming up to Capitol Hill, lobbying with, and also the Egyptian government hiring outside lobbyists, former members of Congress, if you will, in cases, to lobby for them. It's just crazy. And I think this administration, there'll be stories written, who lost Egypt, with regard to that. I thank you both for your Mr. Smith and Mr. Pitts.
Thank you very much.
You might want to ask them.
Chairman Wolf, thank you. I do have a full statement that, since I was unavoidably detained, I'd like to ask to be made a part of the record, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I want to thank you for calling this very important hearing. I welcome our distinguished witnesses, who have been absolutely dogged in their determination to defend the rights of Coptic Christians and all minorities, all those who are beleaguered in Egypt, as well as in other places. Nina Shea has been one of the champions of human rights worldwide, including in Sudan. But I just, one of the regrettable aspects of having a foreign ops appropriations bill come to the floor in a very, very truncated fashion, that is to say, we will not have the ability to offer specific germane amendments to it because it'll be one big mammoth omnibus appropriations bill. But I have weighed in, and I know others have weighed in as well, concerning the importance of having conditionality to aid to Egypt based on a number of criteria, including and especially religious freedom. My understanding is that the Obama administration is pushing back on even the mere mention of religious minorities. I know this to be a fact. I find it absolutely deplorable. We have done this elsewhere, so it's part of a pattern. We have done it. I just had a hearing yesterday with 8 panelists who are, including 2 people, who have spent more than 20 years in the Chinese gulag, or Laogai, Harry Wu among them, Pastor Bob Fu was the other, and academics and others, and we have been so silent on human rights abuses in China, the deplorable situation that has gone from bad to worse under this administration. Hu Jintao comes in and spends the better part of a week in Washington, and not a single word, not one public utterance by President Obama about the deplorable situation in China, including Nobel Peace Prize winner Liu Xiaobo, who got it right after Obama got it a year ago. He meets with Hu Jintao at a press conference at the White House and never even mentions the word human rights, and defends Hu to the press, including the Associated Press, who asked a very, very important question about human rights in China. So fast forward to Egypt. No big surprise that everything is being done so covertly, if it's being done at all, that you can't, it's unrecognizable. Meanwhile, the Coptic Christians are being singled out for barbaric behavior on the part of the Egyptians. And when we're talking, and I'm lobbying for it, to get specific language into this appropriations bill that singles out religious freedom, minorities in Egypt, there is pushback from the administration, and we may not be able to get it into the bill. The right for assembly, certainly let's put that in there. That's one of the things that will go in. But there comes a time where you draw lines in the sand, and we're talking about $1.3 billion in U.S. taxpayer funds. We have to be far more clear about what our expectations are for a country receiving that money. So I'm very, very disturbed with the trajectory as well as the on-the-ground. Frank Wolf, our chairman, said a moment ago about who lost Egypt. When the Arab Spring occurred and people in a Pollyannish type of way were saying, oh, look, the Muslim Brotherhood are not carrying signs attacking Israel or attacking the Coptic Christians or attacking America. They're much smarter than that. Are we so naive to think that somehow there was what their real intentions were? Very, very concerned. And of course, the SCAF, as you've pointed out, Dina, again, I've raised it, but as you pointed out in our most previous hearing of the Helsinki Commission, they routinely come into town, aided and abetted by people at the Pentagon and the Obama administration who just want to go slow. Don't raise that. Don't do this. Just look askance and somehow it'll go away. It will get worse. It will get demonstrably worse, as these elections are clearly suggesting, unless we take very clear, unambiguous actions. And I think linkage to our foreign aid is paramount right now as to where our levers might be. If they walk, then they walk, because they're already walking, and they're running, I would suggest, respectfully. And the naivete on the part of the Obama administration is appalling. We're doing it with China. We are losing China. We're losing other countries where our human rights voice has been so incredibly muted, and we're doing it now with Egypt. And so I have no questions at this point. Just a couple of weeks ago, you answered all of the questions that I posed to you, and I thank you for that. It's great that the Lantos Commission is doing this, the Helsinki Commission is doing it, the Human Rights Subcommittee, which I chair as well, has been raising these issues. So there's a great deal of discouragement. I would also add, and I hope the State Department will take this back, Michael Posner, when I asked him about Michelle Clark's very strong statements the other day concerning this was months ago, concerning the buying and abduction of young Coptic girls who are then sold into sexual slavery, and that's what forced marriages is, as well as forced Islamization, said that, well, we don't have any specific information, and you were there, Chairman Pitts, and was very dismissive of the idea. And I told him, unless you have really deployed people to investigate this in an aggressive fashion, please don't put the veneer of somehow we looked into it and didn't find anything. We have not looked into it. Michelle Clark has. She has a very good record as number 2 on human trafficking at the OSCE. She has worked that job. Now she's a professor, of course, right here in town. I'm very disturbed at that the statements that he made, and I did tell him so at that hearing. Chairman Pitts, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thanks, gentlemen, and recognizes another distinguished human rights leader, gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there are always the usual suspects at meetings like this, and you're usually topping the list, you and Mr. Smith here. And I would start by asking that my written statement be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I also want to express that I identify with every syllable that Mr. Smith just expressed, because I think not only does he have a clear understanding of the circumstances, but represents my perspective on it completely. It is always a dangerous thing when, in the name of trying to be reasonable and friendly to people, that we overlook human rights abuses. It only leads to great challenges down the road. I heard it put in a little verse one time. It's perhaps a little archaic to use in a meeting like this, but it says, "No one gains when freedom fails. The best of men rot in filthy jails, and those who cried, 'Appease, appease,' are shot by those they tried to please." It generally always comes home when we don't have the courage to protect the innocent. Sooner or later, the aggressor expands their scope of aggression, and it affects all of us. And if we don't have the courage or the will or even the clarity to protect those who can't protect themselves, and to stand up for the foundational rights of religious freedom and just human freedom in general, then we do ourselves no favor, and we certainly fail the test of leadership. With that, let me first say that I also identify with the question that Mr. Pitts has already asked, suggesting that in the last couple of decades that whenever there is attacks against Christians, a lot of times the military rounds up a number of Christians and a number of Muslim participants, and just it sort of fades away at that point. And I know that there's a lot of questions about the Egyptian military's willingness to act as they should. So let me put the question a little differently. Ms. Gerges and Ms. Shea, I would probably pose the question to both of you. If you could suggest to this panel and this Congress just one policy or one directive or one effort that we might make in a proactive way to catalyze the appropriate protection for the religious minorities, and certainly with the Coptic Christians here being the subject of the day, what would be the one thing that you would say would be critical to our policy? And I'll start with you, Nina, if that's all right.
Well, thank you, Congressman. It really struck me when I heard the administration's witness, and it's nothing, against her. I know it's the policy. I've been doing human rights advocacy for many decades, and she said it was complex. Yeah, we can't condition aid because it was complex, and it really reminded me of the excuses regarding South Africa and apartheid. It was just too complex to take on. And there is a right and a wrong here. It's against our interests to see the Copts wiped out or religiously cleansed, driven out. They are moderating influence in Egypt. They are the bridge between East and West. They provide an experience of different people living together from different religions in the Middle East. They are the largest non-Muslim community in the Middle East. They are committed to nonviolence. I've talked to the Maspero Youth Union people and some of the Thebes Legion folks, and they are committed to nonviolence, so they do, as Dina said, want to stay and fight for their freedom, stand up for their freedoms. I think it's absolutely essential to condition our aid. It's not at all complex on the Copts' right to justice, that there should not be impunity, the handshaking when there's murder or pogrom, the imprisoning of Copts, and pretty much only Copts, after the Maspero massacre. It's an abomination. So I would say the end to the impunity is extremely important. Of course, the equal right to build churches and repair churches is very, very symbolic, because that's a real signal from the officials, from the government itself, that Copts are not equal citizens. And don't have a lot of confidence in the new law regarding the building of houses of worship, because there's all sorts of language in there that talks about distance from mosques and so forth. And I think whatever the distance is, 500 meters, whatever it is, it's very difficult to find a space like that in Egypt. There are a lot of mosques, and it can be administered in a very unfair fashion. There shouldn't be any regulation other than zoning regulations. So the impunity, the building of churches, I think are extremely important, but the list is very long because there is so much oppression against the Copts.
Right. Ms. Gerges, would you like to?
Sure. I'd just like to add that over the course of the past almost 40 years now, the U.S. has given aid to Egypt, $1.3 billion to the military solely, and a very minuscule amount in economic assistance. That has not really won us leverage or influence in a positive sense, as much as it has emboldened the Egyptian government to view this assistance as an entitlement. So U.S. taxpayer money is viewed as an entitlement. The armored personnel carriers, which trample people, are being funded by U.S. tax dollars, and that really is an abomination. Now, one thing, the SCAF always, as the Mubarak regime did before it, always raised this issue of sovereignty and don't intervene in our national affairs. I'm here to let you know that Egyptians strive for the United States finally to take a moral position vis-a-vis their country and what's happening there. They do not want to see the U.S. fall into the same trap with SCAF as it did with Mubarak in supporting the strong man that oppresses everybody and builds up immense frustration. They would very much rather see the United States be on the side of the people. And the people here are, Egyptians are intuitive, bright people that get it. They now see what the SCAF has been up to for the past 10 months, and they understand that the SCAF has had a very destructive role in actually unraveling all the gains of the revolution. The revolution, partly in response to what Congressman Smith said, was in large part non-sectarian in nature. This is true. And yet everything that the SCAF has done for the past 10 months has really undermined that culture of tolerance that prevailed during the early stages. So I think Egyptians would be heartened, if anything, to see the United States take the moral and ethical position, not to mention that this is a position that is in the United States' interest. Otherwise, we will find ourselves again siding with a government that is against its people, and the whole situation blowing up in our face very soon again. Because one thing that has changed from the Egyptian revolution, if nothing at all has changed, is that the fear factor is gone. People feel emboldened. People feel like they can and should take to the streets should things go horribly wrong again. And what we want to see is the building of Egypt now. We don't want to see a period of prolonged, indefinite instability, which is what we're looking at right now.
Well, thank you, and well said. Mr. Chairman, I guess one of the concerns that I would express is that this administration, in its approach, has missed the power curve here. I mean, we've seen the recent elections, and with the rise of the Salafists and a huge number of those representing the Muslim Brotherhood having very significant gains in the election. And, of course, the outer areas perhaps are going to be even more dramatic in that fashion. So it is something this administration needs to get on top of quickly. Let me just say for the record that I completely agree that our foreign aid in this case should be clearly conditioned on the actions of the acting government of Egypt, because if we don't have the courage to do that, then it as you say, it certainly emboldens the enemies of freedom in the clearest way. So I think that that's something that all of us should be committed to, and I certainly am. One last quick question, Mr. Chairman. if I could direct this to you, Nina, if it's the defamation of religions resolution was replaced last March by Resolution 1618. And did you see, I don't know, perhaps I'll just put it this way, do you see that replacement resolution as becoming a springboard for limiting free speech in a sense in the same way as the defamation of religions resolution?
Well, thank you. I do, because I think that the administration is making a terrible mistake to keep this alive and breathe, and it is actually breathing new life into this dead defamation, the resolution that was sidelined by the 1618, by inviting, announcing at an Organization of Islamic Cooperation conference last July to Washington to discuss how we begin to implement religious tolerance. And while, you know, trying to moderate language about religion is a good thing, attacks on other people's religions, it's to work to the OIC Secretary General has called this move a move of standing united with the United States, between the OIC and the United States. From their perspective, they see the United States as endorsing their program. Their program is to curb speech about Islam, to have the state, to have every state around the world start regulating speech on behalf of Islam and only Islam. And they have for many years worked to get an international human rights crime against defamation of Islam. That's what their charter calls for. That's what their action plan is about. This is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, a 56-member state group based in Saudi Arabia. And now we're going to be working with them and pulling our members of our Homeland Security, of Justice Department to come and testify before this conference is taking place in Washington. It's going to take place now next week with the OIC, with others. But the United States seems to be the only one in the dock here. Now, maybe from the, you know, Secretary Clinton said this is not going to result in limits on speech, that this is not about the U.S. being put on the carpet. But in fact, de facto, that's what it is. I mean, we're the only ones, we're hosting it, it's here, we're being put under a special scrutiny that no other government's going to get.
Well, I thank all of you, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, it's frightening to me because the things I hear you say should be apparent to this administration, and it appears that it isn't. And you know, I guess the most temperate thing I can say about that is it exhibits an astonishing amount of naivete here, when our own government has almost been, or at least representatives of our government in UN has almost been complicit with these calls for anti-defamation types of laws that are clearly suppressive of religious freedom. And so
extremely demoralizing for those in jail, the bloggers, the women's rights activists, the human rights activists in prison for raising speech that has been declared blasphemous.
Yes, ma'am. Well, it kind of goes to the question, Mr. Chairman, that if, you know, with the freest nation in the world, it has given us great influence and strength, and if we don't use that for the furtherance of freedom, then we miss the test of our time. So thank you, sir.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman. Thank you for your insight. And thanks to the second panel for your testimony. You've been very eloquent and informative. Thank you very much as we